This
companies,
conference will
especially
now be
U.S.
recorded.
Steel. And I'll tell you why the tin stackers had such a problem. They called them tin stackers because the Pittsburgh fleet had aluminum colored silver stacks on there. And they really took it on the chin during especially the fall, November of 1905. But in September of 1905, a big storm came onto the lake and it sank several ships around by the Apostle Islands. The Pretoria, one of the largest wooden vessels ever built, was lost. The Savona was lost. And all the newspapers were saying, oh, this will never be equaled on the lakes, as we often see in the newspapers. And then all of a sudden, October 1905 comes across, big storm, and down goes the Mendoza, one of the largest Canadian schooners on the lakes. And the Faye, if you've ever been to 40 Mile Point Lighthouse, you've seen the bones of the Faye on there. Several ships went down in October of 1905. And again, the newspaper said, hopefully this is the end. Well, unfortunately, you're seeing November now on your map. And that low pressure system is moving in. And what happens during these gales is we see the Arctic air coming down from Canada. And then we feel the moisture of the Gulf moving in. And when they collide, along with the evaporation of the Great Lakes during the fall season, we've had all the summer to heat up the lakes as much as we can barely heat up Lake Superior. Now it starts to let evaporation take place and clouds and storms start to build, and that's where we get the snowfall from. So watch this low front now moving over Minnesota into Wisconsin, and it just starts to slam that west side of Lake Superior. And this is some of the damage that's done. And this isn't all of it, but this is the significant wrecks that came off. In the Apostles, you see another wreck that went on. It was only a couple of months old. The William Corey was the flagship of Pittsburgh and considered to be indestructible at the time. They thought that it was big enough that it could not be bothered by these storms. But here they were trying to pull that off of the other far edge of Michigan Island there. And then all the way down the coast, the Spencer and the Amboy, thank heavens for the fishermen up there. They rescued the crews of those boats. Both of them were destroyed, both boats. The Edenborn was towing the Madeira, and both of them, the Madeira broke apart and was sunk, and both lost crew members. The Lafayette Manila, another crew member was lost on the Lafayette, but the Manila seemed to make it through. We'll show you a picture of that as well. And then we'll go into more detail about the three at the bottom. But this is Lafayette. This is the damage from the storm. The bow section, you can see it cut the pilot house in half. There was nothing that they could really recover from this. And the only thing I've seen diving is probably one of the actual heating elements from the tubes that we saw from the heaters that were inside the bow. The rest of it's all just little tiny pieces because they really did collect whatever the steamship company didn't get, the locals took, or later on divers would bring up, the pieces they could find, the binnacle and such. The stern, though, had an engine that they could take out, and that would eventually go into another freighter, and you could see them coming into Duluth with what's left of the Lafayette. Here's the Crescent City, and look at the proximity to the bluff. This shows that they just threw a ladder from the spar deck, the top deck by the hatches, and crossed. And sadly, they lost a man doing that too. It was just so, wet and crashing waves and such. I also believe that they lost their turkey dinner that was in there too. That one of the newspapers said that the Crescent City was robbed of their turkey that was inside the fridge. So the locals went on board and tried to get whatever they could. Of course, these freighters are worth a lot of money. This one's actually not only wedged into a rock, but it's actually sitting on a big spire. Think of it a bad example, but a vampire stake. It's stuck through the middle, so you can't just pull it off with tugboats. You have to jack it up, and that's exactly what they did was jack it all the way up off that rock and then pull it. And then they finally got it rebuilt and put back into service. The England, you can actually see one of the rescue guys coming off here. They crashed ashore just a mile and a half from the lifesavers in Duluth. So that worked out real well for them. They were all saved, the captain being the last one taken off. And here you see an artist's depiction of how they did that, maybe exaggerating the winds a little bit on this picture, but maybe not when we see the pictures from the Mataafa later on. Here's the Edenborn being salvaged. The big part really wasn't pulling the ship off. That it turned out to be food poisoning that over 60 crew members got. So compounding the difficulty in trying to rescue these. people that were on board, or forgive me, the ship itself. As far as the people on board, the mate, this is an interesting article I saw with the power of being able to do deep searches now, where we used to just go in when we're looking at shipwrecks and we would search a week before the storm and then maybe a couple months. Keeping in mind, you're going through 30, and in the case of the Free Press, Detroit's Free Press, you could go through 110 pages, and you're looking for any snippet, and you're hoping your eyes catch it. Now we can just type in this case, Edenborn and mate, or Edenborn and shipwreck, and it turned out that the guy became a minor celebrity. William Moore had problems with his stomach, and because he survived a shipwreck, they made an actual newspaper ad about him with this special Dr. Walker ointment, I guess is what it is, for bowel and stomach trouble. So minor celebrity after the Edenborn went down. Here's the Edenborn in more modern times. In the 1960s, it was determined that it would make a great breakwall off of Cleveland. And this is 1962, and it's nudged right into its fleet mate, the James J. Hill. And this will now become, you can see the marina on the top part. So think of the James J. Hill there in the proximity to the marina. When we look at this aerial picture, here now we're turned away, now looking more, this would be towards the east, and you can see the marina. And so that would be the James J. Hill on the far outside edge, and then the Edenborn would be on the inside edge. And the rest of it is about 15,000 or 1,500, I can't remember the count, old automobiles that they buried and turned it into the park that's down there. Here's what's left of the Madeira, at least the bow section, which flipped up for it, and it's very unique in that it's kind of reaching for the surface. You can hit it within 30 feet. It's an easy dive. I've been down there. The deeper stern section is about 100 feet, and they're still slowly finding everything. They just did a really cool 3D map of it that I'd like to add to my lecture one of these times. I want to make sure I got permission before I did that, because it shows the boiler and a couple other pieces as well. Really, yeah, we won't call them a star because shipwrecks are horrible and people lose their lives. But the most notable from this storm had to be the Mataafa, and this is really showing you the way. This is a photograph from the storm itself, and think about the amphitheater construction of Duluth, where it kind of has a sloping hillside. So anybody that lives in that area can see the waterfront. They can see the ships trying to get in or go out. And whenever there was a big, storm, there was certainly a lot of action down there, and people went down to see it. And it turns out the Mataafa had dropped off its barge, and it went to anchor, and it survived the storm fine. But the captain tried to make it through. Humboldt tried to get between the two breakwalls, and in the storm, it was too difficult. The wind and the waves were pushing them all around, and they stabbed into the north breakwall. You can see the breakwall off to the left, and then it settled down into the water. And the real problem was for those poor guys on the stern. There's no cabins on the stern of this early model of the Mataafa. The bow section, you can see at least there's a pilot house in the captain's office that you could at least get a little more higher above those crashing waves. But for the guys in the back, that turned out to be fatal. One guy tried to climb into the ventilator to try to get some protection against the wind and froze there. 9 people lost their lives. 2 of the after crew made it forward, and you have 14 that survived in a very dramatic picture from the lifesavers. And this really should be the picture of lifesavers on the Great Lakes. This is the crew bringing them in from the Mataafa. Lifesavers, a little bit different than the Coast Guard. I mean, they don't have the technology. Their whole job was to row out to these wrecks. In one case, my talk Bottle of Goodbyes, we talk about a lifesaver going 20 miles with his crew out into chasing a schooner. So it was very difficult work. Their motto was, you have to go out, you don't have to come back. And unfortunately now for the Coast Guard, they have helicopters and cutters and a lot more technology, and it's certainly more safe. I asked one of the captains, I said, so is your motto still, you don't have to come back? And Captain Muth looked at me and said, listen, if we're doing our job right, we come back. Okay, that makes sense. This is the Detroit newspaper from 1913, and this storm really earned the moniker King of Storms. When you get a storm that comes in over a weekend and you lose 12 ships with all hands, and it affects every Great Lake except Ontario, so you have death and destruction on all of the Great Lakes except Lake Ontario. It's the king of storms. And the reason this happened was because, most of these captains watch the storm through their barometer. They can tell when the low pressure comes in, it lowers the glass in the pilot house so they can see that barometer go down. In the case of the 1913 storm, it bottomed out. And then when it started to bounce back up, many captains believed it was okay to go back out, and they did. And a lot of them got caught as the second part of the storm actually came in. The death toll between 260, you see the headline here, 273, with the upside down price in that picture. This is a one that's always captivated me. This is the Plymouth. It's one of the three wrecks that are still missing right now. Two of them are on, actually, there's this one in Lake Michigan, the Lee Field that is up in Lake Superior, and the largest ship lost in the King of Storms and the largest Canadian freighter that was in the storm, the Carruthers, is missing, 550 feet long, which is hard to believe, really. But the Plymouth story is so interesting because while we didn't have any survivors from that ship, we had a whole crew of survivors in the tugboat that was towing them. And we also have, I'll show you in a minute, another way that they found out what happened on board that boat during the storm. So the James H. Martin was woefully underpowered. It was towing the barge. You can see right here, the Plymouth is actually loaded with 68,000 cedar posts. A world record in Menominee, and of course they were making a great profit for Hubel Lumber. But then they lost a boat called the Wisconsin, and it sank, and they got into a big dispute with Hubel. And eventually, when it came back for the Plymouth, they wouldn't let it sail unless they had some kind of a libel on it, which would be a lawsuit against it. And the only way that the court would let this boat go out is if they had a police officer on board, a U.S. Marshal. So the undersheriff of Menominee, Chris Keenan, resigns and goes to the Marshal Service, and he hops on board this. And if you read my book, Bottled Goodbyes, you'll get a whole backstory on how he actually knew the crew of the Plymouth. He knew the crew of the tugboat, especially the one of the owners, McKinnon, who was the chief engineer, went through all kinds of troubles, even though they were all heroes after saving a ship that went down, the Hattie Wells, that went down the year before. McKinnon got into a problem, as we talked, and Scott, the other owner, got locked up into jail, so they had to find a captain. And McKinnon found a guy named Satunsky, and the guy, it turns out, didn't have a license to go where they were going. But of course, we don't find this out until they go into the greatest storm on the Great Lakes, and they sail past St. Martin's Island where they have dinner. The winds change direction, and now they start to rage for 16 hours straight at 60 miles per hour. There's no place to hide, and now the tugboat is taking water, and it can't pull that massive ship. It's floating high up in the water. There's no cargo on the Plymouth, and they can't turn around and take the people off. They can only signal them and tell them to drop anchor and hope that the recaulking that it did that season, the steel arches that were put in Bay City, would save it. Well, of course, McKinnon comes back after they take off to the UP, and they hide behind Garden Peninsula. They look for the ship and the seven guys on board. Not a single person was around. There's not a mast in the water. There's hardly any debris. The only debris I've seen is an oar that was found on St. Martin's Island. And then he comes back. So McKinnon's got to go back into Menominee and tell them, hey, this is why your undersheriff is dead. So he immediately, you see in the headline, blames the captain for the disaster, blames the lawsuit, saying, why did you make me do this? And kind of put a spin on himself and saying that it really wasn't his fault, which probably would have held up until a message in a bottle came ashore. And this is near Onekama, Michigan. So it'd be north of Manistee. And this is a mock-up that I did, and it's very accurate. It's got the Central Coal Company. That's how it was written, and that's how people understood where to send it. You know, they might not have known what the Plymouth ship was, but because it was written on a receipt from a coal company that actually loaded the Plymouth before the storm, it made it to the families. And it was a tragic message. It said, from Chris Keenan, the undersheriff, U.S. Marshal now at this time, we were left up here on Lake Michigan by McKinnon, captain of the tug James H. Martin at anchor. He went away and never said goodbye or anything to us. We lost a man last night. We've been out in the storm now for 40 hours. Goodbye, dear ones. I might see you in heaven. And then after he signed it, another handwriting was below it. And it said, I felt so bad. Another person wrote this for me. Hubel, the lumber company, owes $35 so you can get it. Goodbye forever. Now, in the history of notes that I've studied very extensively on the ocean and on the Great Lakes, this has to be the most complete of why we were lost, what happened, the very details, and then not only a goodbye to his family, but also a note to go collect some money, which it's tragic, and it's almost a little bit humorous because of that part of it. There were also two bottles that were found from the HB Smith. This was a monstrous 500-foot freighter that came into Marquette. The story always goes, and the newspaper follows, that Jimmy Owen had a bad season. He was late all the time, and his job was on the line. That's been refuted. In fact, Fred Stonehouse, who's written fantastic books about the Smith, says that that's not true. That Hawgood the owners of the boat, said that's, we weren't going to terminate him. None of that was true. But they did say, and there's eyewitnesses from the Choctaw and other ships that were along the dock that said that captain he wanted that cargo in a bad way. It was frozen by sleet, and he ordered the ship, even though the winds were picking up and most ships were pulling away from the dock to prevent damage. He ordered it lashed to the dock and to get loaded as fast as he could. And he left out of there before all of his hatch covers were all put down. And this is a vessel with, I think, 30 hatch covers, smaller than we typically see on a big freighter here. But here they are going out into the storm, and the eyewitnesses saw the snow squall come in, and the ship vanished as it went past the break walls. So what happened? Well, if we believe the bottles, they say that they broke up just 12 miles out of Marquette, and they say that ripped at the number 5 hatch, I believe is where the note said. We wouldn't know this, and they said it might be a fake. The date seemed wrong. It was, I think, 3 days after the storm. So people wondered, was it just because the captain, who is allegedly the author of one of the notes, did he just guess the date wrong, or was it just a prank? And when they found the Smith off of Big Bay, more like 30 miles out of Marquette, you wonder maybe it is fake because they misjudged their distance by a great deal, which, even in a big storm, at least by the time that they were in the storm, or even maybe some dead reckoning, if they could see the shoreline, they would have known they were much further north. And that's why it took so long for people to find this. Eliason and his crew finding it way off of target, and only because there was a anomaly, a target that they wondered what it was. They didn't think, hey, this is where the Smith could be. We just didn't think it made it that far north, trying to get to the safety of the lee of Keweenaw to get out of the storm. This is the stern. It's 500 feet deep, same depth as the Edmund Fitzgerald, so very difficult to get down there. This is a nice shot of the lee field, one of the ones that's still missing. And I know for a fact that the guys that found the Smith are looking for this one. It'd be a good find, since they've done so much discoveries, especially up in that northern Thunder Bay area where it was lost. This is a nice shot of the Carruthers, and one of the very few pictures of this brand new freighter that only made a couple trips. And that's because it just wasn't around long enough to get its picture taken. It was built with extra steel to take on, quote, more storms. And of course, it did not make it through. We found debris, and that was it, and some bodies from the Carruthers. And the mystery is still out there on where that ship is. This was truly, though, the mystery ship. This is an upside-down freighter that was spotted, I believe it was from the lighthouse at Fort Gratiot, where someone saw an object, and so the boats raced out there. And for days, they could not get a diver in to figure out what it was. If you notice how buried it is, the name is underwater. So the stern is dragging on the bottom in about 60 feet of water, and the bow is far enough underneath that you can't see the name. So every newspaper, especially the maritime papers, were guessing at the color, the size, what it could be, until finally they paid a diver, William Baker, to go down there. And of course, Baker goes down, has to use his hands because the water is so stirred up, to feel the raised letters. And he finally figures out it's the price, but he gets back on the boat, won't tell anybody what the name is until he gets paid. I think he knew a little bit better about the newspapers in the area, and he got his cash and told them. And all the papers came out with, the diver is Baker, and the ship is the Charles S. Price. Now I'm going to surprise you, because part of my job, I said, is finding these people that were eyewitnesses to storms. And I never thought that I could find a survivor from 1913, much less find the wheelsman that had a very famous picture taken that I'll show you, and also the last to see several freighters that were lost and very infamous on the Great Lakes. This is Ed Knabe. He was 18 years old. This is a picture from World War I when he was a medic. He was a farmer from the Thumb that became a sailor. And imagine being at the wheel as an 18-year-old and sailing into the King of Storms.
The HB Hawgood headed north for Lake Superior on November 9th, disregarding storm flags that indicated a change in wind direction and velocity. 18-year-old wheelsman Ed Knabe described the 30-foot waves that were soon breaking over the top of the pilot house.
Action.
on North, and the seas out of Saginaw Bay looked like mountains. Captain A.C. May knew his only chance was to head back to the St. Clair River, so he ordered Ed to turn the ship around and head south. At noon, they spotted the Charles S. Price pushing her way through the storm. It was about a 90-mile gale. How much longer? I have no idea. 15 miles further, they saw the tiny package freighter Regina barely afloat. I looked to the east, and I didn't see that little boat anymore. It must have tipped over and sank. Knabe also saw an ocean freighter near this location. He later found out it was the Wexford, lost with all hands near the Canadian shore. And I looked up ahead again. Here comes another one. Oh, that crazy man coming into a storm like this. Which one is that? That was the Isaac M. Scott. Headed into the storm, but it never came back. Captain May realized he would never be able to navigate the narrow channel in the river, so he again ordered Ed to turn around and head back into the storm. Ed put the freighter up on the beach near Point Edward. Let it pound and drag anchors, and that saved the ship and the crew by throwing the ship out of control. There you see it on the beach right there. The story being told in my book, The Wheelsman, which I chronicle 4 different wheelsmen, including the 1913 storm and the 1940 storm we'll talk about in a minute. So what happened to these ships? Well, let's let Noah film this with an underwater robot, 175 feet down. Look at the anchors upside down. So this is the bow. And there's not much to see on the bow section at all. It's inverted, as so many of the shipwrecks from 1913 are. And this might be part of the reason why it is. This is the rudder now. So we're going back in the skeg that attaches it so you can actually have the steerage of the ship. That other end on your left-hand side is supposed to be attached to the ship. Now, we don't know if that was from the fact that the fantail is crushed. You can't even read Isaac M. Scott Duluth in one reading because it's so broken. It could have been that that was when it went down, but the storm could have also disabled it because we think that could have been the problem with the Charles Price. This video I took before zebra mussels. This is 1991. And look at the rudder is gone. It's ripped off. Now, remember, it was floating down, so it could have been torn off again, but that could have been the problem. The Regina, which many people thought collided with the Price because one of the bodies of the engineers of the Price had a Regina lifeboat. We know it was actually an abandoned ship. We found 8 people that were in a lifeboat that unfortunately didn't get to Lexington, which was closer in Michigan. Look at the rudder intact, the propeller intact, because it was abandoned ship. Unfortunately, they had to sail all the way across to Goderich, and that's where they were lost and why everybody drowned. Here's the Wexford. This is the ladder going up the deck, and see all the zebra mussels on there. This is about 70 feet deep. And if you look now, there's no cabin up here. This would normally be the pilot house, and all of those cabins were destroyed by the storm. Those poor people inside had no protection against the waves. And as we go behind the ship, which is even more significant, that diver is hanging onto the stub that's supposed to have a rudder. Where did it break off, and did it just make the ship lose control and could no longer plow into the waves and make it safely through? The Wexford being upright, which is ironic because, like as I mentioned, so many other ones have been found upside down. The Hydrus is right side up. The H.B. Smith, thank heaven, is right side up. We have access to those pilot houses and any details that might be there as we slowly gain information from what happened. The L.C. Waldo, we know all too well what happened. In fact, this made history all around internationally, I guess, because the L.C. Waldo had a full crew. They got stuck in the
storm, and the lifesavers decided they'd come out to get him off Keweenaw. And here's the Keweenaw Peninsula all the way up in the location. You can see how remote of the LC Waldo. Eagle River had a real struggle to get out there. They had a small boat. They couldn't start their big boat engine, and they had to turn around and come back, and they were highly delayed until finally they got the big one running, and they made it to it the next day. The portage station had a tugboat that towed them all the way out there, and they made it there the next night before, but it was so iced over that they had to wait till daylight to safely be able to chip their way in with axes to get in there. And when they did, they saved 22 men, 2 women, and Tony the Bulldog. And with that many days, and the foods were pretty much down to just a can of tomatoes. And sadly, they were eyeing Tony the Bulldog from what reports were. So I'm glad that these teams got there. I'm also glad for that lifesaver on your far left. That's Anthony Glaza. And this guy not only had an amazing career of life saving, but he was an accomplished photographer. All the pictures you see from the storm and especially the Keweenaw, the Turret Chief, and all the ships that went down, he took pictures of, and really an asset for all of us who study, especially the shipwrecks of Lake Superior. Then he moved into advanced level Coast Guard, where he was actually in charge in Chicago, and part of the investigation into a storm we'll talk about in the middle. 17 gold medals. Think of that. In 1915, they were all awarded, but it was 17 medals went out to these people for this amazing, 24-person save from this ship. So I don't know that that's been equaled. I haven't looked that deeply into it. You see the 2 keepers that are the big captains for the services right there with Tucker and McCormick, who were very famous from the rescue as well. So the Waldo has a long life. It gets renamed the Mohawk Deer, and they decide they're going to scrap it, and they tow it over to the Mediterranean Sea, where another big storm hits it. So here the survivor from the 1913 storm crashes down and sinks by the yard that was going to pull it apart, almost like it was being defiant. And now it sits there, and I've never seen it. I'm hoping it's off Portofino, Italy. You can see the bow goes up towards the surface in relatively shallow water, and then the stern's a little more deeper than 100 feet. But to visit the Mediterranean would be a thrill of mine, and I'm saving up my pop cans to do it. Here's the Gramer. This is one of the wrecks that was pushed aground in Ohio, but not the most famous loss on Lake Erie. In fact, that would be the Buffalo Lightship. And this is the first time that we lose one of these portable lightships with its entire crew. 6-member crew, the captain from Onekama as well. We mentioned that's where the bottle came ashore, Captain Williams. And the crew was all brand new. This was a brand new ship to sit, built in Muskegon, Michigan, with a whaleback design. Unfortunately, steel on the bottom, but unfortunately wood on top. And when the King of Storms came, it wasn't going to stop them at all. And remember, the lightship has to stay on station. If there's a big storm, they protect the entryway past Waverly Shoal at Buffalo. And without the lightship, you wouldn't be able to know how to get in there. So they drop their big anchor, 5,000-pound anchor, and they sit there and they wait out the storm, hoping that they can guide these ships in. And unfortunately, by morning, there was no boat left anymore. And all they found was some boards, some wreckage, and the chief engineer's body, Charles Butler. And this board was significant. It said, "Goodbye, Nellie, ship breaking up fast, Williams." Remember, the captain was Williams. And unfortunately, his wife was not Nellie. It was Mary. And this has gone to a lot of speculation, but Mary herself said, no, the crew didn't know me. They were all brand new. It's not his handwriting. I think somebody wrote it for him and just heard him wrong, and they just didn't get to know her yet. So she took a train with her brother from Michigan to Buffalo and searched on board the Crocus, looking for anything that they could find. And of course, they never found her husband. The ship wouldn't be found until a year later, and 2 different salvors had to work on it. A diver was almost killed trying to bring it up, even though it's shallow, and they finally towed it underwater and to shore, where they pumped it out and then brought it into Buffalo, where they rebuilt the engine and rebuilt the hull, and then took it to Detroit, where they turned it into a brand new lightship, essentially. And that went out to 11-foot shoal. That actually stayed on station up near Escanaba, North Green Bay, until they built the lighthouse there. And then they sent this to the ocean, but it never had to have service again. It went to become a VFW hall, like a meeting place. And sadly, vandals burned it or sank it, destroyed it. But there is a grave there in Onekama. I was just up there a couple of weeks ago, paying my respects and filming part of Final Run, which is a new PBS documentary. This is the beginning of the storm that is actually today is the anniversary of the Armistice Day Storm of 1940. This is the Tacoma Narrows Bridge being shaken apart. It's like a mini version of the Mackinac Bridge. They knew it had problems when the winds came through. It would oscillate. When this big storm from 1940 came through, it destroyed it. And lucky for the people, you see a car up top. All the people got off. Only somebody's pet was lost, which is tragic. But thank heavens, no human lives were lost on there. Here's the storm. You can see it. It's raging from the bottom. The arrows come in from the left down and then swoop its way back up as it's going over Des Moines. And now the winds are building. So anybody who left from Chicago, or in the case of the Davik and the Minch, are coming down through the straits and actually going into Lake Michigan. Now you're going to face what will eventually become 126-mile-an-hour winds. They're so strong they blow out the portholes at the Lansing Shoals Lighthouse. And sadly, it turns the temperatures from a balmy 50 degrees where hunters went out without their jackets on. It went sub-zero and they couldn't get in because of the waves to get off of the places where they were duck hunting, and they froze to death. And so there was many people lost there. Over 1 million turkeys were killed by this sudden freeze, and sadly 70 sailors that went down, including 2 fish tugs that the crews were all lost. And then the William Davik was the big ship that went down off Little Point Sable, found in 200 feet of water upside down, just like the 13 ships. This is Billy Allen. He's from Detroit. I've met his family. In fact, someone donated to me part of an oar from the Davik, and it had the word Davik on it. And I never feel that those belong in either a museum or with a family member who, represents that. And so I gave that piece to the family and told them, if they found it in their hearts to donate it to a maritime museum, that would be significant. And perhaps they will. This is what happened to the Davik. You can see Jeff's picture. When we dove it for my documentary, Safe Ashore, it's 200 feet deep. That's deeper than I'll go. That's robot territory for me. But my friend went down and he landed on that smokestack that you see behind the propeller way back there. It was that bad, the visibility. And then the zebra and the quagga mussels, the deeper version, cleaned it up so well that now Jeff Voss took this picture of the entire stern section with the rudder. And you can see it's jammed into the propeller and the blade was sheared off. So they lost control. They ran right into the storm. And then all of a sudden were pushed into the trough of the sea and then rolled over. And that's why they're upside down. For the 17, or it was really 19 people in the first on the Novadoc, that underpowered freighter came up from Chicago, and the storm just built and built. By the time they hit Muskegon, they knew there was no place to go. So they just rode it until they got pushed ashore near Pentwater. This is again up by Little Point Sable. And 2 of the cooks were killed. The waves, you can see them crashing through the midsection of the pilot house here. They were washed right out of the galley. It went right through the skylight. In the forward section, they had a little more of a break because, again, they were elevated higher than the stern section. So all those people were in the captain's bedroom until the door collapsed from the wave, pounding the door. And they went into his office afterwards and took a pot and broke the furniture up and set a fire in it and then opened a porthole to let the smoke out. At least it kept them warm and they were dry. In the Oilers' room is where everybody gathered out of the lee side of the storm, and they were still in the stern up to their knees in frozen water. And at this point, this has been the first night, the Coast Guard realized that they had more troubles in Pentwater with the car ferry, and they thought it was loaded with people. So they looked at this and said, well, they're not, underwater, they're grounded, they're not going to sink anymore. We're not going to go to the beach. And they couldn't find their way to the beach, even though the locals all had cars down there. And this became a big snafu for the Coast Guard, as we'll find out. So they went, the Coast Guard, actually, this is the City of Flint 32. There was hardly anybody on board. They managed to get everybody off. They took passengers first and then the crew. And there's a lot of really good photos coming out of this now from people who are giving up their collections. And I think with the storm getting a little more notoriety with the museum in Ludington and such, where really had been largely forgotten. This is the guy that took it on the chin, though. Christopherson had an amazing career, but unfortunately, his reaction to the storm and how he divided up the crews and that nobody got to the Novadoc in time. It was 2 nights that those guys had to await rescue, and the Coast Guard never made it there. In fact, they got stuck in the mud in Pentwater, and a little fish tug went out with these 3 guys. On the left is Corky Fisher. In the center is a Native American named Joe Fountain. And on the right is Captain Clyde Cross. And It's just an amazing story that I tell in Safe Ashore. I also tell a good portion of it in my book called The Wheelsman as well. But to see, I actually have footage to show you of the storm itself and, of course, the rescue, which we found. This is the fireman that was standing in knee-deep water, Howard Goldsmith, and he talked about how that ship was rolling and the flames from the boiler with the burning coal as it was turning 40, 45, 50 degrees. It was crazy inside there where it was just spilling all over. And he talks about what it was like to look out that same porthole that they're trying to bail out of and see somebody come into the rescue.
The storm started to abate. And before long, we saw this boat coming towards us. We thought to ourselves, my God, somebody's coming to our rescue. And sure enough, that boat came up to the bow of the boat. They took on everybody off the bow, and then we started heading for shore. And don't think that wasn't a rough ride. That little fishing boat did everything but turn upside down. But it finally got ashore, and they took us into the Coast Guard station. The Coast Guards, they wouldn't come out to get us. It was too rough for them. They wouldn't come. But that little fishing boat came out to get us. And they took us off, took us into the Coast Guard station. And in the Coast Guard station was a big round pot-bellied stove. And it was warm. And they brought out all the rum we could drink. I had 3 or 4 shots of rum. I dearly loved rum.
I think that's going to be the name of my next book. I dearly loved rum. Just characters, these people. And I think when you see people like Howard, and I interviewed Lloyd Belcher, the wheelsman, too, you realize why I've dedicated my life to finding these interviews, to recording these interviews, to making sure that they stay available. I donate all of my programs to PBS. It costs them nothing. I help promote them because these stories don't belong to me. These stories belong to the ages. Now, selling books and videos is crucial to me because that's how I put air in my tanks and gas in my gas tank. And there's always bills to pay for the electricity that it takes to make these stories. But the truth is, I try to spread the amazing stories. There wasn't Gordon Lightfoot songs written about all these things. So only the Fitzgerald gets the real notoriety, as you probably heard on the November 10th. Yesterday, but now we're hearing more about these other ones too, including this one. This is the Carl Bradley. It reigned supreme as Queen of the Lakes for longer than any freighter. It was over 20 years. Up until now, the Tregurtha has been now the Queen of the Lakes for the longest time because we're just not building freighters as often. 1,000 feet 13 is what that one was. So think of the size. This is 630 feet long. But it was getting ripe in age, built in 1927. And the captain worried that there was some rust through the hold and that he wanted to get fixed in dry dock. He had written a note at home, and a big storm was building. So they got their cargo out at Gary, big football-sized limestone used in making steel from Rogers City. And then the crew went north, and they could have stopped at Cane Island and waited out the waves, but they were a big enough ship, and they've been in storms like this before. So they started to cross Lake Michigan. And as they went behind Lake, this would be actually Gull Island is the area, but if you think of where Beaver Island is, just south of those islands there is where it broke across the deck. It started to tear in the cold temperatures. And in the case of the first mate and the Watchman Mays, they said it broke directly into two, but that's been contested. In fact, if it did break in two, there's a bigger lawsuit. In fact, the Bradley in 1958 was one of the biggest lawsuits we'd ever seen from a maritime disaster. And it came out right away with around $8 million that they were hoping for. And of course, normally you'd settle it out for the cost of the ship and the cost of the cargo, and it was empty. So, they moved right away to try to limit those expenses to less than $1 million. And lawyers like Vic Hansen were working on this case to really make it come together. But what happened was the Army Corps kind of knew where this vessel was. It was down by Gull Island. They had a target that was about 580 feet long, which was less than what the Bradley was. But the shipping company said, well, we'll get a drill stem. We'll take a mining ship and go out there and put a camera down there to take a look at it. And if we can do that, maybe we can see if the ship's in one piece. If it is, then their liability is less. If it did tear in half, the lawsuits could come in that the shipping company didn't take care of the vessel. Here's a scene from Deep Six, my documentary, the first to tell the story of the Bradley and the Morel, and of course the first time you'd ever see television interviews with the survivor from the Bradley.
Sonar located the hull some 12 miles from Gull Island, but the target wasn't verified until the ship owners went searching the following year.
I had a personal curiosity in the situation from the standpoint that I could not understand how that ship could go down. As a matter of fact, I had even planned on being on that trip.
The research drill ship Submar-X was commissioned to search the wreck site, finally relocated by a private sonar firm.
We put a drill stem down with a TV camera on it, with floodlights.
What those TV cameras found still causes controversy today. Headlines disputed what the survivors had witnessed.
The historians of the lake writing the stories always talk about the Bradley breaking in two and sinking in two pieces. It did not. Had the after end broken off, my feeling is without any question, we'd had more lives saved because she would have had a buoyancy that would have kept them afloat long enough for some people to become safe.
Well, I'm very discouraged about that because what Chris Buchanan says that it did not break in two is absolutely positively wrong. It did break in two. I was there. I seen it. Elmer Fleming was there. He saw it.
Buchanan, who led the 1959 expedition to the Bradley wreck site, says silt clouded their view. By using heavy anchors and winches, they slowly viewed the entire wreck.
I saw the name on the pilot's house and down the gunwale and to the stern.
To this day, I can visualize it in two pieces. Whereas Chris Buchanan was not there, he is only going on pure hearsay. And these so-called pictures that U.S. Steel had taken saying the ship was in one piece but were never produced. I've never seen them.
I don't know whatever. New York Admiralty Council had it, and whatever happened to it, it probably was destroyed. The case was over.
It was far from over for Frank Mays, who joined up with a Michigan explorer to visit the shipwreck in person.
I actually took this underwater video of the submarine. I was involved in this expedition with the Delta and also to the Edmund Fitzgerald. So very lucky to be part of not only looking into history, but part of history by bringing Frank back to the shipwreck. It was very significant. This is a picture I took of him looking out. Unfortunately, the visibility was horrible, just like Buchanan told him, and they never saw the tear. And it's still been disputed. In '97, Mays went back out there with Fred Shannon, and the headlines all read in Traverse City that it was 90 feet apart, that it was officially true that it was broken apart. But if you look at this sonar from the state police, it's not. And by seeing the divers that go down there now, it's 360 feet deep. It's a very technical dive. There's only a 20-foot rip in the deck, and they're in line with each other, the ship is. So I don't believe for a second that it's in two pieces. I think that it's broken, and it led to them to believe it went down in two pieces. But it would be great to get a better sonar, and especially to see that area that's been buried now at the end of the boom to find out really what the true deal is on that. And now that Frank's gone, I mean, sadly, he was such a fantastic speaker on the Great Lakes. I wish we would have heard more from him as well. And this speaker too, this Dennis Hale survived this ship. This is 1966. Actually, this picture is taken in 1906 when the Daniel J. Morel is launched into the Saginaw River in Bay City. And it turns out it had a long career. I mean, if you think going into 50 years, it was on the lakes and it was laid up for a while. And Dennis got a call to go out and get a cargo late in the season. This is into the 26th of November. The actual sinking would have been the 29th into the 1st of December. Real older ship, problems again like the Carl Bradley with brittle steel going into storms. And all Dennis remembers, he's the sole survivor from this shipwreck, is they were off of Michigan's Thumb. He was late for the boat, so he picked it up when he got to near the Detroit area and got on board, ate dinner, went to sleep, and at 2 a.m., all of his books fell off the shelf. And when they fell off, he woke up. He realized there was a problem, so he threw his life jacket on. It was pitch black because the generator that's aft in the ship, all those lines were shearing off as the boat was breaking into two pieces. So he's feeling his way around. He runs out on deck, and his toes are squishing through the snow. And the guy, Norm Bragg, who survived the Steinbrenner, who was one of the crew on the Morel, said, "Get back in there and get something warm. We're going down." So he went back in. All he could find was his pea coat, which he put over his life jacket, which is backwards from what we normally do. And that saved his life. He goes into the water. Unfortunately, Morel never gets a mayday. And that means that no one's looking for them, including the Coast Guard cutter Acacia that was in the same storm, just miles away. They didn't know to look for him. A helicopter, Lonnie Mixon was the pilot, flying back from the Nordmeer rescue where he just saved 8 Germans, flew right over where Dennis was, and he could have saved probably the rest of the guys on the raft. But no one had reported this ship missing until the next day. And Dennis was floating along on the raft. He'd been tossed over several times with waves that he says were 3 stories tall. And he started to get thirsty. As you know, you're out there for 2 days. He wanted to drink the water. So he used a flare gun with the lanyard, leather strap that would keep it in your hand. And he would dip that into the water and drink the moisture from it. And after a while, he lost the flare gun. Of course, he never got to fire it. There was never another ship in that area. So he wonders what happened to it, but he thought, I'm so thirsty, I've got to eat the ice on my pea coat so that I can, I can survive. And a ghost appeared to him. And the way he describes this ghost that appeared that told him, don't eat that ice, is pretty significant.
His eyebrows were white and very bushy, which was in contrast to his mustache. He had a white mustache, very neatly trimmed. His skin was, skim milk. When I was growing up, had a blue tinge to it, and his skin was like that. And his eyes were very, very deep set, very. I somehow feel that he communicated to me with his eyes, and very thunderously though. And he told me not to eat the ice off my pea coat. He said, "Don't eat the ice off your pea coat." And so I laid back down. And I went to sleep and I had the afterlife experience. And suddenly found myself back on the raft. And I looked around for this guy and I called him Doc, I guess because when I saw him the first time, he administered to me. And I just, called him Doc. And I yelled for him and he didn't come. I looked for the lanyard. I was dry again, as thirsty as I could be. And I looked for the lanyard and the flare gun. I couldn't find it. And I knew I didn't throw it overboard. And yelled for him and waited, and he never reappeared.
Just an amazing story. And Dennis sadly got cancer and went so quickly. I mean, this is a guy that survived the shipwreck, survived when he was born. His mother died. I mean, the story is just unbelievable. It was so great that when he went to write his book, I published it for him. I went through and did the layout and everything because I felt it was such a great story to tell. And we thought we'd have forever with him. He's indestructible, but sadly he passed away. And now we still have his books and, of course, the interviews and such. This is a picture that a newspaper from Port Huron took that just by chance were flying over. And that's Dennis with his hand up as he's signaling to the helicopter to rescue him. And sadly, everybody else had passed away from that raft experience. The picture on the right was shared by one of the crew members of the Bramble that went out on the first dives from the Morel. They found the stern section, which had sailed for 5 miles after it lost its front end, which is a miracle, but they did not know where that bow section was for over 20 years. You can see on the left-hand side a big chunk of metal that those hard hat divers brought up so they could do metallurgic tests, and that's where they realized that this was a brittle steel that was prior to World War I or II when we came up with a steel that would be more flexible in these storms. Here's the bow, and Becky Schott took this picture. Dave Trotter, Larry Copeland found this bow section and quickly relocated the stern section soon after. But now it's covered with zebra mussels, where the early video that I share in my documentaries is all Dave Mabry did a great job of showing the paint that still said Daniel J. Morrell. All the pilot houses, everything was labeled, the warning signs and everything, but all of that is masked now. The trade-off being better visibility, where we can now see most of the shipwreck off of the ship, which you couldn't do before, including you can actually see the C on the top of the mast from here of the Cambria logo there. Now, of course, I was delayed because of my technical issues, but I really can't do justice to the Fitzgerald because, quite honestly, it's a full hour discussion, and I have at least 2 talks on the Edmund Fitzgerald. I just published my brand new book. It's 300 pages called Tattletale Sounds, which for those of you who love Gordon Lightfoot realize that's one of the lyrics. The wind in the wires made a tattletale sound. But I'll go briefly over the ship so at least we can do some justice to it. And because I love Gordon, but he got a lot of things wrong in his song, including fully loaded for Cleveland. It wasn't fully loaded, and it certainly wasn't headed for Cleveland. It wasn't coming back from some mill in Wisconsin. The mill was in Minnesota, 80 miles into Minnesota. But when this vessel was launched in 58, it was the largest on the lakes, and it immediately started setting records. What was more significant to me was that the Murray Bay and several other boats, including the Homer, which was launched from the same shipyard as the Fitzgerald. There were 2 more boats that came out of Detroit area. This would be E-Course, just near the Ambassador Bridge. And after that, they shut down. And this ended 300 years of building boats on the St. Clair and Detroit River. So it was significant and a big blow to Michigan, which only had Bay City, that turned out a couple freighters and some military vessels into the 1960s, and then ended a real prowess of what we had as a shipbuilding industry. But the trick on the Fitzgerald was how, after it was no longer the longest, was it still breaking cargo records? How was it one of the first to bring in 1 million tons, in one season? And through the interviews I've done with countless sailors that have sailed it, including the cook, the old cook was not on the boat when it went down. The old cook had bone spurs, and he had got off the ship in September. They brought in a replacement cook in, and sadly, Bob Rafferty is the one that passed. I don't think that Bob told the men, "It's been good to know you," or it was not too rough to feed them either, because the cook on the Anderson didn't have any problems feeding everybody. So there's a lot of problems with the song, but my hat's off to the man that wrote "Where Does the Love of God Go When the Waves Turn the Minutes to Hours." That's pretty significant. I mentioned I was able to go down there. Again, it's a whole nother talk. I spent an hour and 26 minutes going around the pilot house, and we got lost and went around the stern. It helped me to realize that that ship never ran aground. And with my interviews with the Coast Guard and my interviews with so many people that have investigated, from Jean-Michel Cousteau into the Sea Grant expedition, Whitefish Point, I just don't believe for a second that was part of it. We did look at the hatches up front, and if you look at this first hatch, it's very significant. There's 2 different things in this picture. When the Coast Guard came out and said, "Hey, listen, we think it was the hatch clamps," each one of those hatches, you see those little C clamps around it. To hold that on, there's 68 of those clamps on every one of the 21 cargo hatches, and it takes time to do all of them. And I agree with the Coast Guard that they didn't put them all on. And of course, every sailor argues with me when I'm in lectures, and I say, well, let's look at the footage. First of all, the stuff that we saw underwater, and secondly, every picture and every movie I've seen of the Fitzgerald, even in storms, does not have them dogged down. This is not anything to pass on to the crew, except for the captain, who was a stickler for overtime, and maybe the first mate, whose job it was to make sure, but the ultimate order came from Captain McSorley. But look at a couple things in this picture, and then I'll wrap things up for you. The hatch, look at the right-hand corner of the hatch, and you see a bumper there, a white bumper that would stop the hatch crane. You see the man on the right-hand side of that, right next to the hawsers. Look above him. That's the forecastle deck, and see how it's straight across. That pole that kind of follows along the deck is the bosun's chair, and that's how they would get off at the Sulaks. They'd put a person on that, and they would go over the side, lower them down, and they could handle the lines on the ship. What else will we see? The builder's plate in the very center of that forecastle deck, mid of the deck, we'll see that too as we go into motion. But the big thing is above that guy's head. That is supposed to be flat. See how it's got a ladder there? This is what it looks like today. This is that same house you see right over the hawser right there. And if you look at the deck, it's now bent like a pretzel from the impact of the bottom. The part of the bosun's chair is folded down. You see the bumper, the little white bumper down there that we were talking about, and the rail is either missing or buried. And now look at hatch one is completely folded in, and look at the depth. If this ship nose down, this should be filled with cargo from at least the first cargo hold, maybe even more if it did really go down in one piece. That now we're going across the builder's plate on the top. You can see the little square, the winches, and that deck is flattened down to the top. That's how much that impact was and how much damage came from hitting the bottom. I don't think it went in straight. I think that it ran into a hillside, and we'll see why in a second. I also wonder, as we go across the spar deck, this is ripped away from the side of the hold. See how the hull is ripped right here? Not a single pile or drop of taconite, and I can see 12 feet at least into there. And as we go over the gunnel of the ship, this is where we were lost half the time. This is buried up to the side of a hillside, and it looked like the lake bottom until you realized you were over the ship. And this goes all the way back, for 2 and 3 hatches are buried largely in mud. But look at how high it is, right up to the paint, right up to the name Edmund Fitzgerald. That's 20 plus feet of hillside that's right there that drops off the bow. And then when you get around the front of the ship, the prow of the ship, you see it's bent 90 degrees. So it did hit, I think it hit sideways in, but definitely by the front, because that pushed that thick steel over and flatten these plates, and you can tell where they're breaking up, and the folds in the metal are actually starting to break up the name. Again, there's so much stuff down there. There's so much information from the people, and I don't really come to big conclusions in the book. My job is to share so many eyewitnesses that helped build the ship, that sailed the ship, that investigated the ship. In fact, if you look at 6 different expeditions, no one's really spent a lot of time in saying, doing interviews with the people that were there and what they saw, and going through the raw footage, which many times, including in the Coast Guard, had a microphone going. So I logged out everything that was said by the Coast Guard and got a better idea of exactly what they were thinking when they were looking at this damage. They came to some good conclusions, and they came to some very wrong conclusions, because quite frankly, they didn't know where they were. So that's all in my book. It's never been published before, and that's the only pitch I'll give for you, okay? Maybe someday we could do the bottled goodbye talk too, which is all the messages in a bottle. Of course, my wheelsman is also a special talk. But if anybody has any questions or any comments, shipwreckpodcast.com. In fact, there's no plural in that. I'm going to fix that. It's just Shipwreck Podcast singular. Has the actual place that you can go to listen to some of my interviews from people that survived these storms. The 1940 anniversary is today. What a great thing. It's a free download you can listen to. Only the Fitzgerald costs money, but it's 4 hours of conversations with people involved in the ship. So I just felt it was important for me to try to at least get some of the time that I invested back on that. So I'll turn it back to you guys. If you have questions, let me know, and I sure hope to join you again soon.
Thank you, Rick. I'm just getting my systems back up here. While we give people a couple minutes to enter questions into the chat, if you have any or comments, please put those in that chat. Want to quickly highlight our current statuses at our visitor centers. Today, the visitor center in Duluth is open until 4:30. It'll be open through Monday. You can see their winter hours posted there. The Sioux Locks Visitor Center just closed November 5th, so we will be closed in Sault Ste. Marie until May 1st. It's a change from our traditional Mother's Day opening, but we will be opening May 1st. And meanwhile, the park is open for its winter hours between 9 and 6 p.m. And you can find almost all of our exhibits, permanent and temporary, on the Detroit District U.S. Army Corps of Engineers website. If you just follow the Sioux Locks links, you'll find the source where all those are posted. I'm going to check our chat, see if we had any questions come in. I will say one of my questions was going to be, will you come back next year? And we'll stick with a November Shipwrecks theme.
I would be thrilled, and we don't have to wait till November. There's so many great talks of storms in May and such, and certainly bottled goodbyes is a great topic of all the messages where I go into heavy detail on the Plymouth, especially.
Well, very cool. You are on my short list.
Great. And my obvious support goes out to all of the folks there that are telling these stories. If you ever need anything from my library, it's very open for you guys to use anything to showcase these stories. In fact, if you want to use my PBS documentary, I can link you to Final Run. That'll give people even more commentary from even a better historian than me, Pat Labadie, who talks about the '05 storm and a couple more in detail. So if you want to link that, we could do that as well.
And not to grab on to Pat Labadie's coattails, but he was a U.S. Army Corps of Engineers park ranger.
Absolutely. And a personal hero of mine.
Yes, he was the man who kind of got everything going in Duluth at the visitor center there, and had built a huge collection of Great Lakes maritime resources.
And so generous to share them. They're just so generous to give them to the library at Alpena so that we can all utilize them.
And I had a question I wanted to ask as well. I was curious, when did you start diving?
91, I actually covered a story as a news reporter of the Jupiter blowing up. It's a 3 million gallon tanker that had gasoline, and we could see it burning from Saginaw. It was in Bay City. And after I got done with the, blowing up all night and covering it, extinguishing it and such, I actually walked the deck of that melted freighter and just was hooked. I had to learn more about shipwrecks, and I luckily got to go to Thunder Bay. I won several awards on some video that I filmed up there, and the station just embraced it. So they helped me to kind of become a historian / diver, where I never thought that would have been possible. Now I look back 30 years now of doing this, and it's just been an honor to get awarded by the Association for Great Lakes Maritime History and the Great Lakes Shipwreck Preservation Society. That's an honor to me, and I just like telling stories. That's my favorite part.
I enjoyed listening to the stories.
Awesome.
Now, you had mentioned that some of the wrecks were beyond where you dive. What are your dive limits?
I did a dive on the Spengler at 165, and it was a mast I could follow down, and I was on air, and I got so out of my mind. As I get past 130 feet, I start to get drunk with narcosis to a point where I don't like it. I'd lose my mind. I think everything's funny, and it's very dangerous for me to be down there. There's other divers that learn to do tech diving, breathing in helium to offset that nitrogen. I have just gotten hooked as a board member at the Great Lakes Shipwreck Historical Society of using robots. They never get cold. They always have lots of light. They can keep filming for hours, and they found over a dozen shipwrecks over the past 2 summers. And I've just been thrilled about doing that. I like swimming. I love being neutrally buoyant because it's like being in outer space. But I love being able to spend countless amount of time on the Curtis, on the Michigan, all these different wrecks that we're now exploring that are in pristine, condition that no one else has ever seen. So you'll probably see me more on a boat than I will be in dive gear, but I'm hoping to get back in the wetsuit or the dry suit, whatever we need next year.
Well, one thing with a robot is you don't have to spend a lot of time on a decompression line.
Yeah. You do, and that, I mean, for the people who dove the Fitzgerald on air or on, gases, that's a couple of minutes on the wreck to touch it, not to do any real investigation, and then 4 hours to hang there. And when you're not moving in Lake Superior, it zaps you no matter how many, snowmobile suits you're wearing under your dry suit or any kind of wire system. It's freezing cold, as you would know, just sitting in a snowbank for that long. It's 35 degrees down there, and it's not any fun. So I think it's too dangerous to do really deep stuff. My hat's off to the people who do it. And we've got men and women who are amazing at it. And I do take advantage of the fact that they can go see them. But as technology gets cheaper, I see a lot of robots doing a lot of that stuff now. And I'd much rather lose a $300 or $500 robot than lose a person.
So Mike is asking, when you explored the Fitz, what were you sensing? And how solemn was that dive?
It was, I'm going to be honest, it was the roller coaster of emotions. And if you search Rick Mixter and Fitzgerald, you'll find tons of interviews and lectures I've done on it. For me, super excited. I'm on the Edmund Fitzgerald that Gordon Lightfoot sang about. It's the largest shipwreck, the most famous shipwreck on the Great Lakes. And then when we dove, the dive after mine, the Delta submersible brought a young man named Scott Purvis and his dad, who owned the Anglian Lady that we were on board. They dove down just to take a look around. And so Scott could write a report on the Fitzgerald, and he found a missing crewman. So now all of a sudden we went from super high to the most devastating low that you can think of, knowing it was a graveyard, yes, but after 5 expeditions, or 4 before us, they'd never found a crewman. So now we are slapped in the face with a missing person right in front of us on video. I saw the video. I saw every drop of it. It was devastatingly real. And he was wearing a life jacket. And we knew it was part of the story. We knew that the song said Lake Superior never gives up its dead, and that it did give up its dead. And of course, the newspapers and TV stations all went crazy afterwards they met us right on the dock, with the story. So yeah, that was what I was sensing, is super excited, super low, and then trying to even out as we came back to have to tell those stories. And I was the first documentary producer to talk about that, to do a story on that. And that's tough to juggle, to know you're going to upset 29 family members, 29 people or 29 guys that are lost that all had families. That is really rough to know that you've got to do the best job you can and still be true to the story. And that's been a balance that I hope I reached efficiently and really to a point where I didn't hurt people.
I know every storm and every shipwreck has unsolved mysteries, but based on your experiences and research and exploration, what is the one that is the best documented and best understood?
Oh, I mean, really, we don't know enough about the Fitzgerald, but it's hard to say that that's not the most investigated. I mean, millions of dollars have gone into the Clelia visit alone. I know there was at least 80,000 into the Delta expedition that Fred Shannon paid for himself out of his own, took his wife's dream home that she was going to build and never got her dream home because of that. So it very expensive, a lot of knowledge there, but that's got to be the most. The Griffin's the other one where I've seen countless dollars spent and never had a Griffin. We've got at least 50 targets that people have said and gone to the media instead of going to an archaeologist. And we constantly get this nonsense that it's been found. We'll know the Griffin when it's found by the cannons that are on board. And LaSalle lost a ship in Texas, and they recovered it and found cannons and a million other artifacts. So we know we're going to find something when the Griffin is finally found, and that'll be very significant. I think we'll know a lot about that one too. But that's about it for the really, well investigated ones. But the Nordmere is another one with the cleanup that it cost a good small fortune at the time, and when they cleaned it up. And we know a lot about that wreck, and it's a great story. That everybody was rescued and pulled off of it. And sadly, that was the same time period that Dennis Hale's crew was lost.
Well, you know what? You have done such a thorough job. We seem to be out of questions.
They're all asleep. I know it.
So I will quickly, once again, I want to promote that next program we have coming up December 1st about ballast water. And I'm also in the chat going to post the links to that program, as well as the link to our virtual visitor center. And we do have a survey on Google Forms, and we use that information to let us know how we're doing and to plan future programs, and invite everybody to fill that out and let us know how we're doing.
That helps me immensely too. I would love to get that information, because sometimes, there's things I'll change when I don't do something efficiently or I do something very right. That helps me immensely too.
And we will make sure to get that to you if we get any feedback on that. And just our handy list of links there. I've posted what I think are the most important there. But oops, they're on our page, which I've just clicked off of. There we go. December 1st will be our next program about ballast water. I think that's going to be a really interesting thing. It's something that a lot of people have concerns and questions about, especially, as you mentioned several times, the zebra mussels. Of course, sea lampreys are a problem, and all the other aquatic invasive species that come in. And it's something that people are worried about but don't have a lot of information about. So we're looking forward to that program next week. And we'll have a better understanding of that impact and what's being done to mitigate any kind of problems with ballast water moving around the Great Lakes. And thank you once again, Rick. And again, as I said, you are on my short list for our shipwreck programs, which are always very popular. And this program will be recorded and placed on our YouTube channel within a week. So it will be available for anyone who would like to share it.
I love it. Look forward to seeing you again. Somebody mentions the Christmas tree ship on there, and I just briefly, it's in my book, The Bottle Goodbyes. It's been extensively researched. There's a lot of information out there if you want to Google it, but I have not dove it yet.
How deep is the Christmas tree ship?
160 feet, I think, plus. I think it's just at that range where I could reach it, but I would not be in my good senses. So I've been talking with some friends with underwater robots to go out there and do a thorough job. It's clearly the most famous shipwreck for people in the Illinois and especially Wisconsin area. It's in the top 3 for Griffin, Fitzgerald, and the Ruth Simmons are certainly big. But my book goes more into all the Christmas tree ships that are lost and why that one became so famous. And maybe another lecture we can talk about.
Super. Maybe December next year. The Christmas tree ships.
I love it.
Well, thank you everyone for joining us, and thank you, Rick, for such an interesting program.
Thank you. I appreciate your time and what you do.